Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this OpenAIRE EUDAT DANCE webinar on fair data in trustworthy data repositories. My name is Marjan Grootveld, and like the other hosts, Ellen Leenaerts and Irina Kuchma, I'm involved in EUDAT and OpenAIRE. We will be recording this webinar and send you a link to the recording and the slides later this week. OpenAIRE is an Horizon 2020 project that supports the European Commission's mandate and ambitions for open science, for open access and open data. Now, the notion of open data as such may not be very valuable. It requires data management and a bit of documentation to make the data findable, accessible, interoperable and ultimately reusable. That is, to make the data fair. EUDAT is another Horizon 2020 project. Its vision is to enable the European researchers and practitioners from any research discipline to preserve, find, access and process data in a trustworthy environment. Trust is of the essence, therefore, and certification is an instrument to inspire trust. We have two presenters today. Peter Doorn is Director of DANCE and Ingrid Dillo is Deputy Director. DANCE, Data Archiving and Network Services, is an institute of the Dutch Royal Netherlands Academy for Arts and Sciences and the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research. DANCE offers a research data repository, which has 3 certifications for being trustworthy. Thanks to the efforts of both our speakers and the international data-related networks and research infrastructures each of them participates in. Ingrid is also one of the authors of the scientific data publication called The FAIR Guiding Principles for Scientific Data Management and Stewardship. Before I hand over to Ingrid, I have a few housekeeping messages. Your accounts are muted, so we can't hear you, but you can use the chat box when you have questions or comments. Please start your question with the word question, and at the end of the session, we will be a Q&A session. Ingrid and Peter then will try to answer your questions. And when we share the recordings and slides later on, you will also find a link to a short evaluation form, and we hope to get a lot of feedback from you. I hope you will enjoy this webinar. Ingrid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Marjan. And welcome again to all of you. And I would like to start by saying that Peter and I are very pleased to be able to speak to you this afternoon. Before we start with the heart of the matter, I would like to spend a few words on our institution DANCE, for those of you who do not know us yet. DANCE has a mission to promote permanent access to digital research data. So we are a data service provider. Our roots are in the social sciences and humanities, but over the last years we've been spreading our wings and we are now also serving other domains like the life sciences. We have a certified long-term archive, that's called EASY, that holds over 32,000 datasets. And another service is NARCIS. NARCIS is the National Metadata Portal to Scientific Information in the Netherlands. It holds publications and datasets, and also information on research institutions, researchers, and research projects in our country. We also host the Dutch Dataverse. Dataverse is being used by a majority of the universities and also other institutions, and is aimed at short and medium-term storage of data. Finally, we offer training and consultancy services in the areas of research data management, digital curation, and also the certification of repositories. Now let's turn to the subject of today. Peter and I would like to introduce to you 2 existing sets of criteria. First of all, the core requirements for assessing the quality of data repositories. And secondly, the FAIR principles to determine the quality of data sets. We will try to show you that these 2 sets of criteria have a lot in common. And based on that observation, we will present a possible way of operationalizing the FAIR principles in trustworthy data repositories. Now, this webinar is going to be a real duet. I will start off with the requirements for repositories, and then Peter will talk about FAIR and our suggested operationalization. And at the end, I will try to wrap it all up. And finally, I would like to stress that we have taken the initiative for this webinar not only to inform you about our ideas, but even more to get your thoughts and feedback on it. So do not hesitate to tell us what you think during the Q&A or maybe afterwards via an email to Peter or to me. DANS was founded in 2005 and we build on a number of predecessors. Based on our mission, we were asked to design a set of guidelines to measure the quality of our own repository as well as others. And this set would eventually become the data seal of approval. After we started off by defining 5 basic principles, and based on these principles we designed a set of 16 data seal of approval guidelines. And after a couple of years we handed this set of guidelines over to the international community in order to increase the impact. And as of 2009 the data seal of approval has been governed by an international board. And at the moment over 60 seals have been acquired around the globe, but with a focus on Europe. So as said, the data seal of approval has 16 guidelines and is based on peer-reviewed self-assessments. Over the last decade or so, a number of certification standards for data repositories have been defined, not only the data seal of approval. And on this slide you see them in a tiered pyramid-like framework. At the top is the ISO 16363 standard as the most elaborate standard for formal certification. It contains over 100 metrics and you need to comply with all of them, and the standard also involves a formal external audit. Just below you see the Nestor seal. The Nestor seal has been created in Germany and it offers an extended certification mechanism and it counts 34 criteria, so it's a lot less detailed than the ISO standard. Finally, at the base of the pyramid we see the core level certification, and there we find the DSA, but also the certification mechanism that is used by the ICSU World Data System to assess their so-called regular members, which are again usually repositories. So 2 sets of criteria at the basis of the certification pyramid, and if you look at them they look very much alike. There are a lot of commonalities between the data seal of approval and the procedure by the World Data System. They are both based on a lightweight standard and they both make use of a self-assessment by the repository that applies for the certification, and these self-assessments are in both instances reviewed by peers from the community. But there is also a lot of complementarity. DSA is strong in Europe, whereas WDS has a lot of members in other parts of the world. And when you look at the disciplines they serve, DSA started off in the social sciences and humanities, and the WDS is very strong in the earth and space sciences. So based on these similarities and complementarities, it seemed only logical to investigate whether the 2 communities could collaborate. We formed a working group under the umbrella of the International Research Data Alliance, and in that context we worked for almost 2 years on the alignment of our 2 catalogues of criteria for core certification. And with this initiative we wanted to reach a number of goals, and you see them here on the slide. We wanted to realize efficiencies and simplify the assessment options, the certification landscape, and we also tried by this collaboration to stimulate more certifications and increase the impact. The outcomes of this 2-year project have been a common catalogue of requirements based, you could say, on the best of both worlds, a common procedure, and we also tested the new requirements in a shared testbed with 6 repositories that were willing to serve as guinea pigs. So this new set of common requirements has a core of 16 guidelines, 16 requirements. They concern the organizational infrastructure of a repository, the digital object management, and technologies. Next to that, there is a requirement concerning the context of the repository that talks about the designated communities, the type of repository, etc., etc. And there is also a possibility for the applicant to provide additional information and also provide feedback on the requirements themselves, because you can imagine they are not set in stone. So I want to lead you through the 16 requirements criteria very quickly. I will not dive deep into it, but I will give you some feeling of what we are talking about here. So first, under organizational infrastructure, what are the topics that we deal with? It's about the mission of the repository, licensing and continuity planning, the fact that data should be used in accordance with disciplinary and ethical norms, the availability of adequate funding and qualified staff, and the level of expert guidance and feedback that the repository gets. So these are the 6 concerning organizational infrastructure. Then there are 8 criteria that deal with digital object management. And these involve the integrity and authenticity of the data holdings, the fact that the data and metadata should be relevant and understandable for the designated communities that the repository serves, the availability of documented processes and procedures in the archive, and the long-term responsibility that the repository takes for the metadata it holds. Furthermore, there are criteria concerning the technical quality of the data and the metadata, the definition of workflows in the archive, the use of persistent identifiers and data citation, and the reuse of the data over time. So the majority of the requirements deal with digital object management. And then finally, there are 2 criteria that talk about the technical infrastructure, and they deal with the operating systems and the hardware and software technologies that are used by the repository, and also all kinds of security issues. And then not only within the context of the technology, but also, for example, you have to look at your facility itself and the users from the perspective of security. So to give you an impression, although I realize that this is a very small font, so I'm not sure whether you can actually read it, but this is a page from this catalog of requirements, and here you see the requirement dealing with integrity and authenticity of the data. It's an example, and you can see here that the requirements are accompanied by a guidance text that provides more context, and also a number of questions, examples of questions that you could answer in the context of such a requirement. It also contains suggestions for relevant evidence that you could hand over in the context of the requirement, and also cross-links with other criteria are identified. So there's a lot of additional information to help you assess the different criteria and write your self-assessment. This new set of requirements has been published quite recently. I think it's 1 or 2 weeks old at the moment. And here on this slide you see the announcement that was made on the website of the Research Data Alliance. And below it you can see 2 links that lead you to the material itself, so to the catalog and the tool, etc., etc. So now I would like to go back. Back to 2005, where we started, to the basic principles of the data seal of approval that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. Because they also formed the basis, I think, of these new core level requirements. And these principles that we put on paper in 2005 stated that data should be findable on the internet, that they should be accessible, so they should have clear rights and licenses, that they should be in a usable format, they should be reliable, and they should be identified in a unique and persistent way so that they could be referred to. Now please keep these 5 principles in mind as I hand over the microphone to Peter to talk about FAIR.
Thank you, Ingrid. Well, the data seal of approval principles were first designed in 2005. But in 2014, a workshop was organized in Leiden, and there a minimal set of community-agreed guiding principles to make data more easily discoverable, accessible, appropriately integrated and reusable, and adequately citable were designed. And these became known as the FAIR principles, those principles that say that data should in principle be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, not just for humans, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, for machines as well. Oops. Excuse me. In the FAIR approach, the meaning given to those principles are that findable means easy to find. What is it? Should I speak more in the microphone? Is this better? Let me just continue and I will see what is, yeah, much better, Tim says. I will speak better in the microphone. That data should be findable means they should be easy to find by both humans and computer systems and based on mandatory description of the metadata that allow the discovery of interesting data sets. Accessible means that they are stored for long term, such that they can be easily accessed and or downloaded with well-defined license and access conditions, and with open access when possible, whether at the level of metadata or at the level of the actual data content. Interoperable means ready to be combined with other data sets by humans as well as by computer systems. And reusable, ready to be used for future research and to be processed further using computational methods. As Marianne already said in the introduction, recently a paper was published in Nature Scientific Data about the FAIR guiding principles, and I can really recommend you to refer to that article that gives much more detail on how the FAIR principles came about. And since then, it happened that FAIR became very popular. Everybody wants to be fair, it seems, nowadays. But we could ask ourselves, what does that actually mean beyond the principles? How can we put those principles into practice? Several attempts so far are going on to implement and to operationalize the FAIR principles. One of them is taking place in the context of the Force 11 group. And you see a short version of that here. More information is also given on in the article I just referred to. I think the different implementations that we currently see being developed are closely related to different aims that people have. One aim can be to make data management more fair by posing requirements when data is being created. I will return to this in a moment, as it is one of the new requirements of fair data management put on Horizon 2020 project proposals. A second implementation can be seen in the light of fair data assessment, establishing the profile the FAIR profile of existing data. And that will be actually the main body of what I will be talking on in the remainder of this presentation. There is a third way of implementing, and that has more to do with FAIR data technologies, to develop transformation tools to make data fair. Recently, this summer, in the context of data creation, new Horizon 2020 guidelines on fair data management came out. And I will be very short on that, but I still wanted to mention this because it will be important to a lot of us and of you, of researchers making proposals for projects in the context of the Horizon 2020 program. What struck me reading those requirements for fair data management is the amount of questions that is being asked to take into consideration to establish whether your data management is fair or not. On making data findable, the guidelines provide 5 questions. On making them accessible, 10 questions. On making them interoperable, 4. And on increasing data reuse, an additional 4. And then there were even additional sections with a total of 16 more questions, which makes the total 39. Although I like the idea of making research data management already fair so that the outcome of the data sets that are being produced will be fair, a number of 39 questions is perhaps a bit too much of a good thing. This may result in researchers no longer knowing exactly what they should do. And it may also make it very difficult to check whether all those fair data management plans that are going to be written whether they are actually put into practice. But now over to my main, to the main section of what I want to talk about. And that is how to assess the fairness of the data sets that are already there. And I want to return here also to the data seal of approval principles. On the left-hand side, you find again the DSA principles on which the 16 DSA criteria were based. And on the right-hand side, the FAIR principles. The DSA principles have to do with data repositories. They put requirements of data repositories. The FAIR principles are for individual data sets. And you can see here the striking similarity between the two. Although it is a similarity, they are not exactly the same. The resemblance is not perfect. A usable format, for instance, as in the data seal of approval, you could say that that is an aspect of interoperability as defined in FAIR. And reliability is a condition for reuse. Another difference is that FAIR explicitly addresses machine readability, and also citability is not a separate FAIR principle but is understood as an aspect of findability, whereas in the data seal of approval this was a separate criterion. We attempted to combine and to operationalize those principles. There is a growing demand for quality criteria for research data sets and ways to assess their fitness for use. So let us try to combine the principles of core repository certification and FAIR. Whereas we use the core certification for the repository and FAIR for the datasets. And we hope by operationalizing FAIR to operationalize FAIR in such a way that it can be applied in the context of any trusted digital repository. Well, how could it work? First of all, I would like to consider the F, the A, and the I of FAIR as separate dimensions of data quality, and try to prevent interaction effects among dimensions, so not have dependencies of one dimension to another. That would complicate scoring, as so do elements that occur under different FAIR dimensions. And I would like indeed to score datasets on each dimension, let us say from 1 to 5. And I would like to consider reusability as the resultant of the other 3. So R, I would say, is the average fairness as an indicator of data quality. Or if we have scores for the F, the A, and the I, add them up and divide them by 3, we get a value for R. And finally, I would like to make the scoring as automatic as possible, although not all principles can be established objectively. But at least we would like to make 2 things possible. To score a data set on the level of fairness at the ingest in a trusted digital repository by a data archivist, and after reuse by data users, by making it possible to have the community review data sets. Here is an example of what I mean, how it could work. For instance, let's assume we have a data set X with the FAIR profile F4, A3, I2, which gives an average of R is 3. It would mean something like this, and I will return to this in a minute. It will have a persistent identifier with limited metadata, which will make it fairly well findable. It will be accessible with some restrictions, which gives it a value of 3, and it has a fairly low interoperability. There is also a second example on this slide, but you can find out for yourself how that average of R is 3.3 is arrived at. Also note that I think that the number of downloads, how often a data set is reused, is a separate criterion. It's not part of FAIR itself. You could compare that to the appreciation of the audience of a television show and the number of people watching that television show. Those are also kept separate and are not combined into one feature. You notice the visualization with stars, but of course other visualizations might be possible, and we are experimenting at the moment with that. Not everything that I'm telling is already there. We want your feedback on what you think, whether you think what we're doing is usable or not. Now going to the operationalization of the individual dimensions. Let's start with the F of Findable. I think that Findable is defined by the metadata, the documentation, and the identifier for citation. And you could have this range starting from 1 to 5. The lowest findability would be that there is no persistent identifier at all and no metadata or documentation. A data set just lives somewhere on the web, but without any additional information. A score of 2 would mean that it has a persistent identifier, but has very little, none at all, or insufficient metadata. And with insufficient, I mean that there is not enough metadata to understand what the data is about. A score of 3 would mean there is sufficient metadata, but no PID, which is still the case in quite a few digital repositories. 4, a PID with sufficient metadata, and that includes at least information on data provenance. And 5, a persistent identifier, rich metadata and additional documentation, and among which additional explanation on how data can be used. Work on further explanation, more detail, examples, and support for FAIR data assessors and reviewers is currently in progress. Then over to the A. Oops. Accessible, which is, I think, defined by the presence of a user license. In the original operationalization offered by the, let us say, the inventors of FAIR, metadata retrievable by identifier is also here, but I think that is already included under F, and it would introduce an interaction between the F and the A that I wouldn't like to see. So here are my 5 criteria. The lowest accessibility would be that there is no user license, or that there is unclear conditions of reuse, or that nor the metadata nor the data are accessible. It will be, by the way, still very hard to find such data. A score of 2 would be indicated by that the metadata are accessible even when the data are not or no longer available. 3, some kind of user restrictions apply of any kind, including restrictions because of privacy, commercial interests, embargo periods, etc. 4 would mean public access after registration, and 5, open access, so completely unrestricted, preferably CC0, but perhaps also CC BY could be included under the highest level of accessibility. Now note that not everybody agrees to this operationalization. There are people that would like to see openness as separate from accessible, but I think it should be seen as the highest degree of accessibility. And also, some people say, perhaps it's not fair, in this sense meant as not just, that datasets that are justifiably restricted where access is justifiably restricted because of privacy reasons can only get a 3 as the maximum score. But I don't think that matters. For the user, it is important that he or she can see immediately that restrictions do apply. And that means that there is no complete access possible. It is for privacy reasons, but I don't see why that wouldn't be acceptable. I would say that accessible 3 is good enough for data sets that contain personal data. Then operationalizing the I, interoperable. Note that this is very similar to Tim Berners-Lee 5-star open data plan. I stuck very close to that, but some of his criteria are already covered by the F and the A. So my interoperability scores would be a 1 for a proprietary non-open format, 2, a proprietary format that is accepted by a DSA, a Data Seal of Approval certified repository, a score of 3 for non-proprietary open format data, also known as preferred or archival format, and 4 and 5 are for bonuses, when data is additionally harmonized, standardized, using standard vocabularies, and 5 when data is additionally linked to other data to provide context. At first we attempted to operationalize the R as well as a separate, the fourth dimension. But we changed our mind, and this slide tells why. First of all, reusability is difficult because it will always be partly subjective. It always will depend on what you use, what you want to use the data for, that defines whether it will be reusable or not for you. But there is a couple of other problems as well. For instance, ideas that were formulated by others were to put there the provenance of the data to facilitate both replication and reuse of the data. But I already included that under F5. Or that data is in a trusted digital repository, because unsustained data will not remain usable. But actually this is an aspect of a repository, so it is covered by the Data Seal of Approval. And next, whether an explication on how data was or can be used is available. This is also an aspect of F5. Then, whether data can be automatically used by machines is an aspect already covered under Interoperability 5. And whether data is reliable or replicable. Well, this can only be known after reanalysis, and it's very hard to say beforehand. So we decided not to operationalize reusability as a separate dimension, but instead to use that as the, let us say, the average of the other 3. Now, how could it look like in a repository? And this is a mock-up, but we could indicate with every dataset in the DANS repository easy whether a dataset is fair or not, or rather how fair a dataset is. And you could do the same in Zenodo, in Dataverse, in Mendeley Data, in Figshare, in B2Safe, or in any repository, preferably compliant with the data seal of approval. And note that these are mock-ups. I just put those evaluations of the data set there, but it could be made visible. We would, in order to facilitate the fair data assessment, we would need a tool. And we would like to develop an independent website for that. A bit like, and perhaps you have ever visited that website, the website of the Data Seal of Approval. Repositories can link to the FAIR assessment website, and that website will provide, first of all, a fair data assessment tool, a kind of a questionnaire with explanation and examples for each criterion. It would also contain a database containing the information on the data sets that have been assessed. That database should at least have information on the repository holding the dataset. It should have the PID to refer to the dataset in that repository, and perhaps some basic metadata such as the name of the dataset or the name of the depositor. It would have reviewer info. His or her ID can be withheld. Anonymous review should be possible, but not necessarily, shouldn't be necessarily anonymous. And finally, the FAIR profile and the FAIR scores. And of course, analytics of all the FAIR profiles of all the data sets that have been assessed. Then I said in the beginning, preferably the FAIR data assessment should be as automatic as possible. And here you see a list of our current ideas of in how far the data assessment, fair data assessment could be made automatic. We think it is possible for a couple of the criteria, but not for all. I'm not going to go through them one by one, but it is clear if you read through this list that a couple of the indicators or criteria has some subjectivity in them. For instance, whether the metadata is sufficient or not. It is at least partly subjective, and it might even depend on the knowledge that you have about a data set. Also, well, you can see that the licenses, those can probably be automatized. But again, the interoperability is much more difficult. Exactly what kind of a format a dataset has, whether that to what category that belongs, depends on generally accepted lists of such formats. And the harmonized and linked criteria depend on whether vocabularies, standard vocabularies, exist in a certain domain, or on the semantic methods that are used to link data to other data sets. And that is what I wanted to say on our way of operationalizing the FAIR data to assess all those tens of thousands of data sets that are already there in our repository and the thousands more that arrive yearly in our repository and repositories around the globe. There are tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of data sets around. And there is only a couple of hundred, according to Re3 data, there is now something like 1,500 data repositories, although I doubt whether every repository mentioned in re3data.org is really a repository, but let us say there is hundreds of repositories. If we want to assess of all those data sets how fair they are, we need a very quick and easy method. And I hope that we have developed a method that can be really applied easily. But I want to hand over to Ingrid for the main takeaways and the conclusion.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, we will try to sum it all up, and here are the main takeaways. The core certification principles and the FAIR principles together form a perfect starting point for quality assessment of data and repositories. And we hope that we have been able to show you how we intend to operationalize these principles in our own long-term repository EASY. We suggest a scoring mechanism to assess the fairness of datasets. This means scoring the F and the A and the I as separate dimensions of data quality. And we consider the R, the reusability of a dataset, as the resultant of the other three. The scoring should be done in an automated way, of course, as much as possible, but we also see that some aspects will remain subjective. And there we suggest scoring both by data archivists as well as reusers of the data. It's our belief that this fair scoring mechanism is implementable in really any repository. And ideally, all certified trustworthy data repositories should in future assess the level of fairness of the data that they hold. I think these are the main takeaways of what we have spoken about. Finally, we want to point you to 3 workshops on related topics that will be organized at the IDCC in Edinburgh next February. And these workshops are on how EUDAT services could support fair data, on OpenAIRE services and tools for open research data in Horizon 2020, and on a Dutch training course called Essentials for Data Support. So with this, we have come to the end of our webinar talk, and we would like to thank a number of people, Jamie Shears from CERN, and also our Dutch colleagues Patrick Aerts, Lauren Seesink and Emily Thomas for their valuable contributions to our thinking. And finally, thank you all very much for listening, and I guess we now go back to Marianne or Ellen for the Q&A session.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Peter and Ingrid, for this presentation. It's now time to answer some questions. We hope the questions are understandable to the presenters, because writing your question is not the ideal way, perhaps, of communication. So I hand back to the presenters, and I think you read the questions and give an answer or the start of an answer.
Shall we just start from the top?
That sounds like a good idea. And I think the first one would be for you.
Yeah, and that is by Eva Mendes, who says that she wants more R's, reproducible, reliable, ready to research again. And yes, reuse is what it is about, and it should indeed be reproducible, reliable, and ready for research. But I simply think that if a dataset is findable, if it is accessible, if it is interoperable, and that, of course, the higher the better, and by definition, it will be reusable. Of course, whether the data is or whether the research is reproducible, whether the research results are reproducible, whether the results are reproducible can only be established with hindsight, after you have tried. You cannot establish that beforehand. But I think that our solution still gives you lots of R's. And does Eva have the chance to react to that or not?
I'm not sure, only in writing, I think. Shall we go on to the second question in the meantime? From Jasmine Böhmer, she says sufficient is enough metadata to understand what the data is about. Are we talking about understanding in the same discipline? Of course, looking at this within the same discipline makes the world a lot easier, because I think both the data archivist, but also if you offer the possibility for reusers of the data to give their feedback, these people, of course, know what they need within their discipline, so that's relatively easy. I do agree that to make this understanding cross-disciplinary is much more difficult. But
I think here it is inevitable. There will always be some subjectivity here. What is understandable to it will also depend on how much expertise you have in a certain area. This is exactly why it makes sense to have the possibility for users of data to review it. And I don't think that in this sense there is just one answer here. It may depend on what the reviewer of a data set thinks of how understandable it is. Whether we would need additional scores, well, I'm not sure whether by introducing more detail you will make the result more easy to understand. I think the simplicity is at least as important as the detail. Perhaps we go to 3.
yeah, if we just try an experiment, we will find out, and we can refine. But let's start simple.
What John Faudin says about to include public domain, I think he's absolutely right. Simply, it would be good to include that also in the text, if it isn't already there in the further explanation.
That's implicit also in CC0, of course, that it's public domain.
Yeah. And then Eva again, do you think that research data should be accessible in terms that any citizen, regardless of their physical conditions, can access to research data? Do you know any initiative working on this accessibility of data sets? Well, I can only say that if at the highest level, so the access 5 open access implies access to everybody. But when there is a restriction, there can be all kinds of restrictions. And again, you could say, yeah, I want to have that into subdivided into all kinds of classes. But I would say a restriction is a restriction. And what kind of restriction that is? There is so many possible restrictions that it is almost impossible to sum them all up. And therefore we would tend to group them all in just one category. And whether I know of any initiative working on accessibility of data sets, essential for some, useful for all, no. Ingrid?
In regards to reusable, could we take into account whether the dataset has a standard structure? Ooh. I mean, we haven't defined separate items, of course, under reusable. We've just said that's the sum of the parts. So
yeah,
that would change the fundamentals.
Whether the data has a certain structure, well, we are speaking of formats. And formats also usually imply a certain structure, but it depends on the format. So again, we tend to not to say that data need to be structured in a particular way. There is so much variety, there is so many different formats. Again, for the sake of simplicity, it is important that the data is in a particular format. Well, you could, perhaps you mean something like whether a database is normalized or not, or anything of that kind. I don't know. But we didn't. If you think we should, please let us know.
The next one is for you, I think, more than for me.
Whether we could use the root mean square instead of arithmetic average. Yeah, I haven't thought of that possibility. You could also do some kind of a weighting of the different letters. I think the simple arithmetic average is good enough. They are the F, the A, and the I are both very clear, and just measured on a scale from 1 to 5. So we'll think about it, but I don't see the necessity. I don't see what we really would win by having the root mean square.
Can we build our own scoring system into our data repository so that every dataset is automatically scored? Well, that would be the ultimate goal, more or less, of what we've been talking about. But of course, we will have to start up doing it manually and see how it works, and also which parts we can automate, because it's pretty evident, I think, that a number of the things that you score are very subjective, so it will be difficult to automate those. But I think it's very important that we start off with a small project doing this and finding out what works and what doesn't work. But in the end, it would be ideal to have that.
Yeah, but when we started out thinking about this, we also just thought of, let us say, building a scoring system within our own repository system. But I think it is much more valuable to have, let us say, an independent FAIR data assessment tool that different repositories could link to. Everybody is, of course, free to use these ideas and implement them in his or her own way, but it would make sense to have a more, let us say, generally agreed upon scoring mechanism that is used throughout repositories. Then you can have, I think, a much better insight in what is going on. Because in the end, it doesn't matter much whether data is in repository A or in repository B. And it would be a pity that a FAIR score in one repository means something else than a FAIR score in another repository. Then there is a question by Daniel, if there is a list of best file formats. Well, I can tell you here that several data repositories or groups of data repositories, as they are sometimes united in bigger research infrastructures, have such lists of different, let us say, levels of acceptability of formats. And in fact, my scoring is also based on these levels that are discerned by repositories. Perhaps there is no universal agreement, but there is a, let us say, a general agreement on those formats and format lists.
The schedule for implementation of all of this in DANS. We are rather in a hurry, aren't we, Peter?
A schedule in what sense? Like a plan? Like we are currently still working out the principles, and the next step, and that will be in 2017, we will start a project for making this data assessment tool. But first of all, we hope to get some degree of consensus on the principles and on how they are operationalized.
And that is also why we need the feedback from all of you to tell us whether we are on the right track or not, I think. The next question concerns the data seal of approval. That's a factual question. All of the information is to be found on the data seal of approval website, which is, I think, also on one of the slides, the link to it. Can researchers score their own data? Oh, that's a nice suggestion.
We have also been thinking of that, and perhaps, yes, perhaps we should also make that possible. It might even, although the idea has not been worked out yet, but it might be interesting also in the context of fair data management, so these requirements for Horizon 2020. If a researcher says, by the end of my project, I will make sure that my data will have an F score of this and an A score of that and an I score of that, and so a reusability of that number, then I don't see why he shouldn't be able to do a self-assessment. perhaps that should be recognizable so that you know that whether the person who is reviewing the data is doing a self-assessment, whether it is a, let's say, professional data archivist, or whether it is a user of the data.
Next question concerns about the definition in the Horizon 2020 guidelines on naming convention. What does it mean? I'm afraid that I do not know the answer to that one.
Naming convention.
Maybe.
Yes. My interpretation is that, but I'm not sure. I should look again at the document of the European Commission. But I think they mean a naming convention of the data sets. Even in our repository, we sometimes get data sets with rather, let us say, cryptic names. So that from the name of the data set, you do not get any idea what the data is about. We have this especially for linguistic files that come from the Max Planck Institute, the language archive. And perhaps they mean this, but I should look it up, and then perhaps I can react later by email. If you give us, if we have your email address.
There are also some suggestions already in the chat box, so that might help as well, I think. Where are we in the list?
Anders Conrad. Well, Anders says, I understand that FAIR data must be machine readable, processable. What does that imply for assessment of fairness? I think this is mainly covered by the interoperability requirement, also by the findability. If there is a persistent identifier, and when the data is fully interoperable, so it has, I would say, at least interoperability level 4 or 5, then I think that the prerequisites for automatic processing are already met. There may be, though, conditions of a repository that hinder this automatic processing, but they are not related to the data set, but then to the repository. I hope I make myself clear. But I think that, to summarize, if there is a persistent identifier and the data set is interoperable at level 4 or 5, then it should be automatically processable.
Next question is, when a data user is scoring, is this not only on the reusability silo in the new approach of the model? I don't think so. I envision that, for example, like we discussed before with a number of other questions, that especially the reuser might have a different view on, for example, whether the metadata or the documentation that is provided together with the data are sufficient or not. So I think they have a role to play also with the F and the A and the I. So I don't think that they only look at the reusability. They can look at all the aspects, but maybe more from the perspective of reuser than the data archivist does the moment the data set is published in a data archive.
Yeah, but isn't Sebastian there also reacting to what Hella wrote?
I was just answering the question from Hella. Let me see.
Hella seems to imply that you only give the score for the R. And then Sebastian says, I also want to see the disaggregate score of the F, A, and I think, but I'm not sure. Anyhow, it's almost
yeah, it's already 4 o'clock.
Gareth says, I have a customer who has asked if we are planning to be ISO 163. This is a question for you, Ingrid.
Has someone documented the gap between DSA and the ISO standard? Well, the thing is, that's not so much a gap in the sense that this item is dealt with within ISO and this one not. It's more the aggregation level. I mean, the dataset of approval gives you a number of general guidelines and is very high level in a certain way. And ISO digs much deeper, but based on the same OAIS reference model. So basically, they touch the same issues, but they do that at a different level.
Yeah, the ISO is much more detailed, and the DSA is a bit more general. And then again on the naming conventions, Sebastian, but I think I really would have to look that up. I cannot say it from the top of my head, how this is intended in the document by the European Commission.
So, and then it's 4 o'clock. Maybe we should hand over, if these were the questions, to the hosts of this session.
Thank you once again. I think you provided a lot of answers to a lot of questions, which is very good. Tomorrow we will have another session of this webinar with probably some of the same questions, but probably new questions. Thanks a lot for now. I think, given the discussion we had briefly in the chat box, that at least Sarah Jones and I will take the questions about the huge number of questions in the current Horizon 2020 data management plan template within the respective projects and see if we can, with your feedback, draw some attention to this large number of questions. On the other side, please don't worry too much about it. The Commission is very friendly, while it is still a pilot, a data pilot. How you answer questions. Of course, all questions are to be taken seriously, but it's not necessary to answer all the questions in a data management plan from the start in the initial version. So I hope that makes it less, well, let's say oppressive. But anyway, we'll take the concerns with us into the project and see how we can draw more attention to them. I think that's all for now. Thank you very much for joining this webinar. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, co-hosts Ellen and Irina in the background. Thank you all and enjoy your data.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.